Okay. Good. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of the Neurocognitive Linguistics Circle. My name is Paul Buzila, and I'm very happy to welcome you to yet another one of our monthly meetings. There are two things that are happening for the first time tonight. The first one is obvious. You can hear me speaking English. This is our first English edition of CELINE, of the Neurocognitive Linguistics Circle. And the second one is the first time we have, for the first time, students presenting. So the stars of the night are some students. That is very good, and I'm very happy to have this this first, because, as you know, the whole thing started as a student circle, actually. But as most things start off quite with some difficulty, we had different professors, different specialists presenting at the beginning, but here we are in the situation in which some students are taking the lead now. So first of all, let me thank these three students who will be presenting today. Ana, Radu, Mirela, Andrescu, and Tiberiu, Bolba. Thank you very much for accepting my challenge and being here tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay, Ana, Mirela, and Tiberiu, they are MA students. They are part of the Mind the Brain MA program in cognitive science. And actually, this is also one of the main reasons for which we have this edition in English, because it is a MA program that happens in English. So all their activity is in English, and their presentation here tonight is also part of their activity in this MA program. So, well, without complicating things too much, and since they prepared their presentation as well in English, we are having this whole meeting in English. Now, before we start, I thought about just having a short conversation with you guys, Ana, Mirela, and Tiberiu. Can you tell us a few words about yourself, maybe, and maybe also about the MA program you are in, how you see it after one semester, and maybe why you chose this MA program? Ana, maybe you can start.
Sure, thank you. First of all, it's very interesting that, as I've noticed, it's very few of us that started with a philosophical background. That's what I have seen until now. And there are plenty of colleagues that are coming from diverse backgrounds. From my side, I come from an economical background, as you might maybe guess from my very dull background that I have right now being at work. So I've been interested initially in studying psychology, and then afterwards, by starting various programs, I have realized that this master's program of cognitive science might not only provide me the general understanding of the tools we use to understand psychology, but we can also understand the backgrounds. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to study the background of the knowledge itself, of everything that involves cognitive science and cognition, starting from, for example, consciousness. I'm glad that it's so much to discover, and initially, because I took a small break from the academic background, I came back and I was delighted to have this new, let's say, having new perspective brought, and when I realized that, well, now I know nothing, so it's time to start exploring and discovering once again. Shortly, yeah. Long story short, well.
Yeah, if there's anyone who does not know too much about the program, just to explain why Ana was mentioning the philosophical background, it is an MA program hosted, let's say, by the Faculty of Philosophy at our university. But of course, it's not necessarily linked only to philosophy. So that's, as you said, I think even historically, previous generations, people were coming to this MA program from different backgrounds. So yeah, that makes sense. How about you, Mirela? Where are you coming from?
So I'm actually coming from the same faculty as you yourself. But I studied German and English. I think you're
Okay.
studying Latin, am I right? Or some type of older language. That's what I've heard.
Who me?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I'm in the Spanish
Oh,
department.
okay. That's a
Yeah.
misunderstanding, I guess.
Well,
Uh,
it's let's say a daughter of Latin.
Yeah, so I also don't have a philosophy background, but just so you know, if you're interested, if there's anyone interested in a master's, even though you do have some courses on philosophy of the mind and such subjects, it is very well integrated. So it's a very interdisciplinary master's, and also very interesting and maybe unique one because there are not many like it. And that's also the reason for which I chose this master. Everything else, I think it was said already by Anna. So maybe Tiberiu, if you want to add something to what I said.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So perhaps a bit of background on myself. I finished a few years ago the Faculty of Electronic Engineering at the Polytechnic University of Bucharest. Then I've been kind of disconnected from the academic environment for a few years, and well, I kind of got interested on along the way. I had a course in philosophy in the first year. Um, I found it pretty interesting. It was very introductory in nature, so we didn't actually. I do remember we didn't delve too much into philosophical problems. First, because it was once every 2 weeks, so there wasn't too much time, I believe. And second, because no one had any sort of humanistic background. Well, in the first year, we didn't have too much of a scientific or, let's say, academic background to begin with. But it kind of got me hooked. So I've done some reading on my own, although I wouldn't call it very extensive. I would call it some light reading. And along the way, I've got interested in neuroscience as well and psychology. So like philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology were the main three things that got me interested. And then I started thinking that perhaps I could pursue a degree. I couldn't start a new bachelor degree, but so I thought that a master's program would fit really well. So I researched some stuff. I researched the programs available in the universities. So I thought that I found cognitive science in at the University of Philosophy. I read the description, I read the curricula, and I actually found it pretty interesting. It tackles a lot of the disciplines that merge into this sort of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary way of investigating basically the human mind, like from an artificial intelligence point of view, from a linguistic point of view, from the philosophical point of view, but like with flavors of neurobiology added to it. And I don't know of any other program that any similar program in Romania. And since it was something that interested me, and it was something that's in Bucharest, and I was in Bucharest, I thought that it's a really great opportunity to apply and see how it works. It's really interesting. It was an interesting first semester. I feel like it was, to me at least, it was more substance than I expected, so to speak, but in a positive way, meaning that it was a lot to learn. But I think it's going good. I think it's really nice, and I'm truly looking forward to learning even more about these kinds of things.
Yeah, great, thanks. And just before moving on to talking about the topic of this evening, I was just mentioning if anyone else is interested to find out more things about this master's program, we have Andrei with us, who's kind of a coordinator of this master, right, Andrei? So,
Hi, thanks so much for the opportunity. Wonderful being here with you, and congrats for a wonderful event. If anybody's interested, yes, by all means, please do shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to follow up. Thanks so much.
yeah, great, thank you. Um, I was going to say that hearing you guys and hearing about your background, that I realize now that you are a great team for the challenge I set out for you, because having these different backgrounds, humanities, technical backgrounds, supposedly help in dealing with this kind of topic. And that brings me to the topic of tonight. Most of you probably know it because I announced it in the invitation. So we're going to talk about large language models. Now, what does this topic have to do with, let's say, the larger topic of our meetings? Well, it's quite obvious. It has to do with language. And it actually is quite connected to what I said neurocognitive linguistics means in our view. Because now what large language models are, if we simplify very much, are an attempt at reproducing, at emulating natural language, right? Or natural linguistic systems. And that's basically what neurocognitive linguistics tries to understand, how this linguistic system works. So, and then we have also all this idea of these models being based on neural networks, which also are an attempt of emulating the biological neural networks. Of course, things are more complicated, and I don't know too much about it, and I'm really eager to hearing about more about it tonight. So yeah, this is the context. Okay, so it makes sense to talk about this topic in this kind of meetings we are having on neurocognitive linguistics. So without much ado, I would give the microphone to the three speakers who will be talking about large language models, what they do well and what they still don't. Yeah, so Mirela, I think you are going to share. Mirela, I think you have to turn on your microphone.
No, I was just sharing
Okay.
the screen. Please let me know if you can see anything.
Yeah, I think it's coming. And as usual, if anyone has any questions, I ask the guys, and they are perfectly fine to be interrupted with questions. Okay, so
Yes,
just
please
don't be
do.
shy.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to speak about the first part of the presentation, in which I try to draw a sort of parallel between the history of writing and how large language models work, with the purpose being that introducing writing systems has been totally revolutionary on the long term for societies. And we are currently going through a similar situation with large language models and their sort of revolutionizing ways in which they could potentially change the way we work, the way we think, the way we do stuff mostly. Yeah. So on the next slide, I put up a timeline of writing systems. I know that this is not a comprehensive timeline because we could, for instance, talk about cave paintings that have been found like tens of thousands of years ago, which do represent human action and not just. But I thought that these points here relate very well in the more recent history, so to speak, in terms of how writing has actually taken shape. So starting with clay tokens, they were used mainly for record keeping, mainly in commercial purposes. So that means trading between individuals or between groups of people, which basically meant that there were different tokens of different sizes and shapes, sorry, which represented actual physical objects, like physical structures. For instance, a cone token, the shape of a cone, could represent a bundle of grain, and a sphere could represent a jar of oil. These tokens were used for this exchange that I was talking about. They were put into something called clay envelopes, which were some sort of small jars which contained these tokens, and they were passed around, and they represented only the objects, the real objects that have been traded, the real goods. Now, this is important in the sense that these tokens were pretty, at least in the same region, or in neighboring regions, they were pretty language independent. So different tribes, different small communities could use those to exchange goods without having the common language. So they only had that sort of semantic meaning that related to the physical objects themselves. And of course, the transition that we see here is not hard. There's no hard cutoff from one to another. There's been a gradual transition over thousands of years, as you can see from the 8,000 to 3,000 BC. But we can move to pictographic symbols where the shift has not been made in terms of semantic content. So the items that were used were still representing only the real goods that people traded, so only in trading and for commercial purposes. But they changed from three-dimensional representations to two-dimensional representations. That means that instead of using clay tokens to symbolize the goods, they developed styluses, the sort of pointy writing instruments that they could use to imprint marks on clay tokens. Sorry, not on clay tokens, on larger pieces of clay. Initially on the clay envelopes that they were using to transfer those clay tokens and signify what has been traded. And then just ditching the clay tokens altogether and just using those clay pieces where they would imprint the number and the shape of the symbols representing the goods. We're going to have some pictures afterwards, and it's going to be clear what I'm talking about. And like I said, the same function has been retained. There's no different semantic content, but there is we can see the introduction of numerals here, numeral representations of these items, because you don't need to send 3 cone tokens to someone to understand what's been exchanged. You can just send a piece of clay that has 3 imprintings on it in the shape of a cone that represent what has been traded. So small change, and that was combined afterwards with the appearance or the development actually of logographic characters. The date is approximate. I've seen small variations around that date, and that was the 3100 BC was the most consistent one. So I kept that one. And the largest change here is that instead of only having like this fixed semantic content of the tokens, there have been introduced these symbols that represented actual words. So in the Sumerian civilization, I understand that the language is pretty monosyllabic, so words contain mostly one syllable. So in this case, they could represent one word per symbol. So for instance, the name Neil could be represented by a person kneeling, because, well, if we make like an analogy in the English language, of course, it could be represented by a person kneeling, because it shows that they're sitting on their knees, basically, and it's phonetically similar. So that's why it works. They were used initially to carve names to associate with the tokens that have been passed around, but then it developed towards imprinting ruler names on funerary stones, and across hundreds of years, this evolved into physical descriptions of the people in the same funerary context, then of describing actions, small actions that people took. So there was a very incremental upgrade or development of the language by introducing verbs into the language and having very rudimentary syntactic structures. And like I said there, they evolved eventually into art and legal systems, such as the Code of Hammurabi. Cuneiform is one of the proto-writing systems that are logographic in nature. Another example would be hieroglyphs in Egypt, which, as far as I understand, have developed based on the Sumerian script. And of course, this doesn't seem to have been isolated to just one part of the world, because we have Chinese characters, for instance, which are logographic in nature, although a bit different, and they seem to have developed separately. And the next part would be the alphabetic system. The alphabetic system. So the difference between, like I said, the the logographic characters had phonetic representations of words. Now the alphabetic systems have introduced actually phonetic representations of sounds. So if we consider that that humans produce limited sounds, like if we think about the limited number of vowels that the Latin script has, we can see that we don't need a large number of representations for those sounds, but we could combine those sounds and we can organize them in different ways, such that we can produce words, and arranging them in like all sorts of ways representing spoken, and could help with better representing spoken language, because it's easier to actually represent spoken language when you can move around the symbols and get a greater variety of representations, like I said. And this increased the complexity of writing systems gradually, and it also contributed to something I'll get to afterward, but it contributed to complexity, a rise in the complexity of thinking. In modern times, we have a different need. So we don't just use writing systems to express spoken language, to have a one-to-one correspondence between those. We also need programming languages, which are formal languages for programming computers, because computers don't use human language. So there needed to be a sort of constructed language or formal language specifically used for this. So words and programming languages don't correspond to don't have the same semantic meaning as words in natural language would have, but they would represent routines and the instructions that need to be executed by the computer. So it's more symbolic in nature. We also can talk about constructed languages, such as Esperanto, which arose from the need to have a sort of global language for global collaboration in light of the ongoing globalization that started a while back. Well, the widespread way of globalization, not the more organic way from before. Or we could talk about Tolkien's Tengwar, Cirth, and Serati scripts that could, through which he wrote Elvish in his books. There's also a small neat thing called essaemic writing. I'm going to show you in the next screenshots, and the screenshots that I took, and the pictures that I have, and the next slides. If you could, Mirela, go to the next ones. Okay, so on the right, we have the clay tokens, like I said, different sizes and shapes, and the envelope. On the left side, we see the imprints. We just need 3 conic imprints to show, for instance, like those bundles of grains and the circles for the jars of oil. And on the next one, we have the other stages that I talked about. So in no particular order, on the left side, we've got the essaemic writing, which is a way of writing that doesn't contain semantic content, but it's sort of, it's visual art. I don't really understand how it works, but as far as I know, it's a different thing in the fact that it doesn't contain semantic meaning as words would have, or as logographs would have in the picture, in the middle picture there, where we can see hieroglyphs and Chinese characters. And there's an actual alphabetic system on the right, the Samaritan alphabet. So this was an intro of the history of writing. I'm going to sort of draw a parallel between that and large language models at the end. But now to explain a bit more about large language models and sort of try to demystify them, make them just have a sort of a better understanding, better down-to-earth understanding of what they are, and to try to not see them as these very magical concepts, so to speak. So they are essentially statistical models built using very large neural networks. We're talking about billions of neurons or parameters, and massive amounts of data to produce human linguistic behavior. They're called large because they use billions of neurons, and because they use large amounts of data, so to showcase what large amount of data means. Meta has been found out that they torrented 82 terabytes of books of written content, not just books, but any type of written content, illegally to train their Llama model. And 82 terabytes would mean around 50 million books if these books had an average of 300 pages. So to train their model, they needed like tens of millions of books of written content. We're talking perhaps hundreds of billions of words just to make them work in the imperfect way that they do now. Their purpose is to solve any problem related to the area of natural language processing, bridging the intelligibility gap, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that word, between human and machine communication. I'm going to get back to that a bit later, but natural language processing refers to any sort of task that a computer needs to do that pertains to processing, understanding, and generating natural language. That said, large language models still work with numbers because they are computers, essentially. So when a large language model processes words, those words are converted into numbers, and operations are performed upon those numbers. So it is a large language model in the sense that the training data is language, and it is specialized to work with language, but it's still numeric in nature. The modern versions are multimodal, taking different types of content as input and generating the same type of content as output. That means that if in 2018 GPT-1 could only parse text and could only produce text, we have the current versions of ChatGPT, for example, or Gemini or Mistral or whatever AI is available, where we could input videos or pictures or recordings or text, of course, and the model will interpret that information, still in using language, and will produce, based on the language it interprets and understands, it generates, will produce videos and images and recordings and text, of course. And another neat feature is that specialized models are large models fine-tuned to very specific purposes. So if I find a large language model solution online that tells me that it can only produce poetry, that it means that it's been specifically trained on poetry and nothing else, so it can learn to do that. Right. On the next slide, there's a small diagram that delves a bit more in detail into how large language models work, but without getting too technical, because honestly, I don't understand all the technical stuff there, so it'd be pretty hard for me to explain it. But essentially, there's the schema here, and say I take a prompt, I open ChatGPT and I write a prompt in it. That's the input sequence for the large language model. I press enter, and the prompt is going to reach the large language model. The first step for the large language model to process that information is the process of tokenization, which means to break down the input into tokens. These tokens could be either words or subwords or even letters, depending on how the system is implemented. But in this case, if we consider the tokens to be words, it was easier for me to understand it this way. The next level would be to transform those tokens, which are words, into numbers. So that's the process of word embedding. The word embedding means that each token is represented through an array of numbers called a vector, which contains the semantic content of each token. So a vector could contain from hundreds to thousands of numbers, which form these array of numbers that I was talking about. And these are broken down and interpreted into numbers and passed towards the transformer layers. These transformer layers the transformer is the core neural network architecture that actually does the interpretation of the information that's been passed to the large language model. And it works through attention mechanisms to understand the relationship between words in a sequence from the presented context. There's a small typo there. What that means is that the attention mechanisms try to focus and understand. They do some arithmetic operations on the numbers that I was talking about, and the values represent the semantic content that these words have, along with their importance in the in the full context of the input sequence that they that has been sent by me in this case. So there are a lot of transformer layers, and with each passing layer, the transformer will add even more understanding and even more context to the input sequence. It will to the to the tokens, until it reaches an output layer where the output layer is still part of the transformer layers, but I put it separately because it's a different process. So instead of interpreting and trying to compute those scores that I was talking about, which refer to the importance of words in the context. They take the results from the other transformer layers and they calculate some probabilities and associate those probabilities to the full dictionary that the language model has access to, which consists of those tens of billions of words that the language model has been trained on. These probabilities will, so one of those tokens, in this case, the token could be considered the word, and one of these tokens will have the highest probability. And that token will be selected as the next token in the sequence, which could start from scratch in this case. But the token will be added to the sequence based on the previous context, of course. And this process will be repeated. So another input sequence will be taken from the new input sequence will be taken and will be interpreted in this way by the transformer layers. And what's going to happen is until there's a window of tokens available for each type of large language model depending on the company's implementation, and this process could stop until it either reaches that limit of tokens or until it reaches a semantic operator that tells it that the input is finished, such as a period at the end of a sentence or a question mark. And then the output is generated and it's shown on my screen, and I see what the large language model has done. Right, so this is how it works, basically. And moving on to the next slide. This is a diagram that shows, that gives a big picture of how the models are trained. So it looks like the model, predicting the next word looks, at least to me, pretty complex enough, and it seems pretty prone to error if we're talking about probabilities. So a safeguard for this is that it uses a lot of data. So because there's count those billions of parameters that I was talking about, those billions of neurons that perform that computation, those computations. We also have those those terabytes, those tens of millions, tens of billions of words, the tens of millions of written works. If we take all this into account and train the model into the first phase here called pre-training, where there's no human involvement, then having, it's a sort of brute force strategy where you just cram as much information as possible and as much computing power as possible. And the base model will learn through a method of self-supervised learning, which means that it employs those attention mechanisms that I talked about, on which it makes the connections between words by itself without any sort of human input. And it reaches this state of a base model here. Now, the base model is trained to understand the relationship between words, but it could not provide a response given a specific question, in a specific context. It would just know syntactic rules, semantic rules, and that sort of thing. So the next part is the fine-tuning. The fine-tuning is a bit more complicated to do. Well, actually, it's a lot more complicated to do because it needs very specific narrow data sets to train the model, which have been very carefully curated and created by humans, which consist of pairs of question and answers that kind of should train the model to understand what type of questions people would ask in this case, and what type of answers it should respond. So Google has an AI studio where this specific functionality can sort of be experimented with. You can just put in some questions and some answers, and that's how the model will learn. And there's the reward system, of course, which means that people will have to provide feedback to the model based on the answers that it provides. So that's how it learns that it's generating what's correct. And we reach the point of the fine-tuned model, which is Gemini, for instance. If I open Gemini in the browser, that's a fine-tuned model. It's going to answer most of the questions that I want to, but it's not going to be very specialized. It's going to know how to answer them, though. If we want something even more specialized, then we can prompt using very specific prompts here, or we can upload documents so that the large language model would provide some answers to my question based on the dictionary that I'd learned, the association between words that I can make, as well as the content of the documents that I am aiming. So if I need information about a specific washing machine from LG, I should maybe upload the manual that I have, which could be 100 pages long, and then I could ask at which page it can find information about maybe a washing program. And it would be way easier for this augmented model to answer that question than for a fine-tuned model to do. This is mainly how large language models get trained, and like I said, they use a lot of data for that. Okay, this is an evolution of large language models. So until 2017, there were incremental updates. Elisa was the first chatbot. It had rudimentary natural language processing capabilities. The SHRDLU and Excalibur, there is a typo in the screenshot. There were incremental updates, and they weren't very much taken into account because this was until the 90s. There was this period called the AI winter, where there was reduced funding into developing AI because the results were not really that promising, so there was no investment. But we reached the point of the recurrent neural networks, which show the first sign of short-term memory showing that they could learn from previous processes into the current processing of information. This is a sort of incremental LSTM long short-term memory is an incremental update on the recurrent neural networks because they just use stronger hardware. The transformers here are the ones, so the transformer architecture is the one that's been revolutionary for natural language processing because it offered something that nothing had before, which is the attention system that I talked about, self-attention mechanisms and multi-head attention mechanisms. And based on this architecture, the first version of GPT has been developed, then Google's BERT has been developed, then like the rest is history. Until 2022, there's been only experimental solutions until ChatGPT has been launched and has been gathering views in a wide array of topics. And we can see that in 2023, there's been an actual boom, like the period that's called now the AI boom, with Facebook's Llama, Bard, which is Google Gemini right now, Mistral AI, the European version from France, and a lot of other solutions that are on the market right now. Okay, so the next slide, I believe, should be about the impact of writing and large language models. So I wanted to make a sort of comparison, but I'm going to go shortly through the impact of writing, with the most important parts being the cognitive abilities. That's what I was more interested. That's what I was more interested in, even though it only has one bullet point there. So basically, having the possibility to write thought, to use words, to imprint words on paper, and have those words contain semantic content and express thoughts through it, allowed a myriad of improvements in cognitive processes, so to speak. Abstract reasoning, for example, which is tied to memory offload. So you don't need to remember, you don't need to always bring information into working memory and use a lot of cognitive resources to do that. You can just have the text down, but you can use the remaining cognitive resources, which are limited, for abstract reasoning, for critical thinking, and for trying to understand more in depth the information rather than always memorize it. This is a discussion in rote learning versus in-depth understanding, as far as I understand, in learning techniques. Then we can talk about attentional control because it's easier to focus on a static piece of work on which you can imprint your thoughts on, namely the paper and the pen. And it did it did facilitate better metacognitive abilities. So thinking about thinking in this case would be easier if one could put one's thoughts down and look at them and process them and reinterpret them. At the same time, of course, we can talk about writing allowing propagation of culture from the widespread spreading of culture from different and merging of cultures from different communities and the appearance of complex civilizations, complex societies, through recorded history, through the formation of complex philosophical systems. Like I said, having more words to express those abstract concepts, writing them down, recording them, would allow people to retain information better. It's static. It's there. It's not based on an imperfect recall, right? And it gradually shifted communication from oral lore to written lore reading, leading to written media. So we're talking about ancient poems that have been written down. We're talking about legal systems. We're talking about all sorts of things. And it democratized knowledge, although pretty slowly, because as far as I understand, there has been a problem in history with the distribution of written material toward the masses, and mostly because masses were later read as well. So that was a slow process. The process of people becoming more literate over time took very long. I mean, it only happened recently that most developed societies are almost fully literate. But it still started the process of democratizing knowledge. But there have been concerns about this, raised by Plato actually in his work. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it correctly. I think it's Fredus, but I might be wrong. I'm not really good at this. So he raised the concerns that writing could negatively affect memory because people would not need to focus as much to remember that information, but they could just write it down, and they would need to always resort to reading it instead of recalling it directly, which ties into the way Plato spoke about dialogue being more important and being the crux of philosophical investigations through Socrates' Socratic method. It supersedes the oral tradition Like I said before, ancient Greek culture was pretty rooted into bards, singing and telling stories and singing the stories. So this could affect the activity of the bards and the way culture was spreading out through oral tradition. The static meaning of text being impossible to evolve refers to the fact that once a text is written down, it's going to be very static. It's not going to be up to, to Plato at least, it was not going to be up to interpretation. It would just be dead content, so to speak. And you would not be able to update it because it's imprinted on the paper. You couldn't do anything with it. And the inclusivity part refers to the elites containing the information into written forms and discouraging dialogue, right? So this is the impact of writing. Of course, we can say that Plato's concerns were perhaps founded at that point. They're not founded. They're unfounded now, we could say, because we saw how we can see how the introduction of writing system has allowed us to evolve. Now, the last slide I want to talk about contains the impact of large language models, and the first potential would be that it further democratizes information. Everybody has, or most people have a phone and an internet connection. You just need to input some, you just need to ask, you just need to write a prompt into ChatGPT to ask for information, and it's going to reply very quickly because it can process enormous amounts of data very quickly, and it doesn't need to wait as much as a person would wait to do some research in whatever topic is needed, even if we're talking about research, consulting a map to know where to go. right? It's easier for ChatGPT to provide an answer with the address. And it provides essential for scientific advancements precisely because of this capacity to process enormous amounts of information, condense them down into palatable forms that could take a shorter time to interpret. It could also interpret data for scientists, for example, but like that's more contentious for now. So I suppose that just parsing it and making it available should be like the main focus of their capabilities, to me at least. And English is the hottest new programming language refers to the availability of people to not resort to programming languages to interact with machines. They can use English language or Romanian or whatever language they want to interact with machines. So it's a big advantage to be able to use natural language to do that and not learn a convoluted constructed language such as a programming language. But there are concerns as well. So the first one is that it's expensive, and it's expensive to run large language models. It uses hundreds of data centers, which use a lot of electricity, a lot of power, a lot of water to cool them down. The graphics cards that are used for large language models consume a lot of energy, so they dissipate a lot of heat, and it could be very detrimental to the environment. Of course, there's the high risk of hallucination and misinformation generation, which is generated not just by the fact that the information large language models generate is probabilistic, but because companies could use malicious information to train their models. This is actually an ethical concern on the part of companies that don't want to make available the training data that they've used, as well as the actual code, code behind the large language models. Mistral AI, for example, is open source, and they want to do that. They want to be as open as possible. And of course, there's the risk of copyright infringement. And the last one is the cognitive concern, which is based on a few studies where students, and where in these particular studies, students were separated into two groups for research. One of the groups used ChatGPT to conduct their research. The others used traditional search engines. They had to return some papers. They had to put out some papers, and the result was that the papers written by the ones that used ChatGPT were of lower quality than the ones that used traditional search engines such as Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever other search engines there is. And subsequently, their knowledge in the subject matter was shallower in the case of the people who used large language models compared to the people that used traditional search engines. So that's kind of it from me. I'm gonna pass the torch to Mirela.
Okay. Just a second, please. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what can large language models do. We're going to look at an overview. First of all, as we all know, large language models can create articles and blog posts. They suggest ideas, write drafts, and complete sentences. They can accurately translate text between languages and preserve meaning and nuance. And before we're going to pass to the next ones, I'm going to stop a little bit on the language translation part. So as mentioned earlier, they can excel at translating many languages, but they are not so effective for languages with limited data. For example, indigenous or ancient languages, highly contextual languages like Chinese Mandarin, or those with complex grammar like Finnish and Hungarian. But very fascinating thing is that language technologies did advance, and they can also become tools for preserving endangered languages. We have some projects like those for the Maori language. Okay, so this got deleted. I'm sorry. for Ainu, and even for Yiddish and Louisiana Creole, which is, I think, some type of French type of language. We're not going to get into much detail about this aspect, but it was nice to mention. Going back on the overview, large language models can help with text summarization. They generate clear summaries of long articles, reports, or documents, and with sentiment analysis. Of course, not like humans do, but they can analyze the tone and sentiment in text. And they are very much used in fields like business analysis or marketing to analyze public opinion, conduct market research, and track social media trends. Um, Again, we have an application in computational biology. Just with a disclaimer that in computational biology, there are large language models like models. Because it is similar, but instead of being trained on natural languages, they get trained on protein sequence. I thought it was an interesting part to add, so here we are. First of all, we have protein embeddings. So proteins are like long strings made up of small bits called amino acids. And large language models designed for protein embeddings typically treat those amino acids like sequences, like text. It's similar how natural language models processes words and sentences, and they learn relationships between those amino acids through self-supervised learning. On the left, we have an example. So those small beads, if I can call that, are amino acids, and as you can see, they form very different structures from one another. And actually, in 2024, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Demis Hassabis and John Jumper for the development of such an application. It is called AlphaFold, and it's a system capable of accurately predicting the 3D structure of proteins from their amino acid sequences. So, is there any question? I think I'm hearing someone. Okay. So the sequences of those amino acids determines the final 3D shape, which is crucial for their function. And AlphaFold takes these sequences as input, searches genetic databases that it was fed on, of course, for similar protein sequences. And by aligning those sequences, the model gains insights into evolutionary patterns. And this basically solves the 50-year-old grand challenge in biology. If you're interested in to look further into it, it's called the protein folding problem. And it's also used in genomic analysis. They basically enable the understanding of mutation effects. They are also called, I think, genomic language model. So again, not on LLM. And they enable the understanding of mutation effects and the prediction of genomic features from DNA sequences. So genomic analysis is a process of studying DNA sequences to understand genes, mutations, and how they affect living organisms. AI, especially large language models, help scientists analyze massive amounts of genetic data quickly and accurately. I give an example. So it basically helps identify mutations linked to genetic diseases like cancer, cystic fibrosis, and Alzheimer's. And we're going to the next section, code generation with large language models. And it's one of the most advanced and commonly used application of LLMs. It's true that AI-generated code can sometimes contain errors, and we still require human input, specifically a human who has experience in coding. But it does speed up the coding process and compared to writing code manually. So, code generation. So, based on a natural language prompt or instruction provided by the user, the LLMs understand the syntax, logic, and context. and generates code that fits the request. And you can handle various languages like Python, JavaScript, and C++. And just like it can translate languages, it can also convert one programming language to another, like Python to Java, for example. And besides generating code from the prompt, it can also analyze the code you are giving it and also suggest solutions. So on the right side of the page, we have something that I tried. Bear in mind, I don't have experience in coding. It just was something that I wanted to do to show you how it works. I gave it this prompt. This was at first a correct code, but I made a small modification, and it instantly gave me identified the error and gave me the solution. This was a small error, uh, but it can also work on more complex tasks from what I've seen. So common errors that you might receive when using it for coding, it's incorrect syntax. So generated code may contain syntax errors that prevent it from running correctly. Incorrect output, the generated code may not produce the desired output or may not meet the expected functionality, and performance issues. Code generation with large language models may encounter performance issues like slow processing or excessive memory usage. And now we're going to the next section, and probably one of the most controversial usage of AI in creative work. So large language models can be used to generate different creative text formats such as poems, scripts, musical pieces, emails, and letters. Due to their formal style of writing, their application when it comes to writing, it's mainly used in fields such as marketing or business. But there are interesting versions specialized in literature writing, novels, poetry, or movie scripts. If you're working in a corporation or have had an interaction with it, you will see that it is very encouraged, the usage of AI at the moment. To give some versions specialized in literature writing, we have Dramatron that can create whole scripts like the ones for movies. So it looks at the starting idea and then keeps producing more parts of the story on its own. And it even asks other robots if it made sense to make sure the story is good. So Dramatron is kind of it has access to more type of technologies. So that's why it has the possibility of asking some type of technology that are part of it for feedback. And we have Copoet that works on predicting and suggesting consistent edits while maintaining poetic structures like rhyme, meter, and meaning. And it basically works like all of them do. The user provides an initial poetic line. He and like roses are red, violet are blue, type of thing. Then the large language model analyzes its style, structure, and meaning, and then it makes a suggestion. And for this part, I would like if you could take 2 minutes, read three poems I've had added here, and let me know which one do you think it's the one made by AI. Can everyone hear me? You can write it in the chat. You don't have to say anything. But I would appreciate.
Give us a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I would also appreciate if you would like to tell me why do you think the one you choose was not made with AI. So I can see the chat. So let me know when you're ready. I'll exit a little bit to see. Okay.
Mirela, did I get it right? There's one that was not made by LLM, and the other two
Exactly.
are
Yes.
artificial, let's say. Okay.
So I'll tell you what I did. I've actually chosen two. Just one made by AI, one made by human. But I also asked around same people what they thought, and they all spotted the one that was made by AI. So I had to make it harder. But it's true that most of the people who identified which one was made by AI have also had experience with reading and things like that. Let's see. So one is human made. Okay, so I think one is human made. Anyone else? Should I go and say the answer?
I don't know. Maybe, or if anyone wants to share their opinion orally, maybe.
I will let the screen a little bit more.
Okay.
Okay, so if no one else has anything to say, I will say what's the answer and go back to the slideshow. So, okay, so it's actually the third one who was made by a human. It's a poem by Lord Byron. Paul, I think you were the one who answered. Why did you thought the first one was made by a human?
Well, I kind of had a very quick reading of the first few lines on each version, and I just had the impression that the first one had some more complexity, let's say, maybe referring to syntactic complexity of sentences. It was just a gut feeling, which was wrong, apparently.
Yeah, so I just tend to make things more complex than they are. I also don't like poetry. I also wouldn't have known, to be honest. I don't think I would have known if someone else asked me. But apparently, it was all about those metaphors that LLMs are using. When I asked them which to rewrite me a poem using the same style, so I gave them the poem by Lord Byron and asked them to do something similar. They did manage to keep the rhythm and things like that, but they do make things more complicated than they should. And apparently, besides us two and someone else, everyone managed to see that. So there was no really a wrong answer, but was an interesting thing to do for more interaction to the meeting. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's not an excuse, but of course, as you said, the amount of training a human has on a certain topic is important, and maybe okay. Also, if we had maybe more time to read with more care these poems, maybe several of us would have guessed. But I think Anna, your colleague, had a question or something. I saw a raised hand.
I wanted to provide my opinion upon the poems and what actually scared me because my gut feeling was the same as yours to respond. And then I also had more time to analyze, so I took my time. And it quite scared me the fact that it tried really hard to mimic a specific emotion. And then I started questioning both because at that time we had only two to consider. But that was my first reaction as well.
Thank you. So yeah, that's an interesting thing to think of to look into. So it does mimic very very good. If you don't have experience, I mean, it can fool you pretty easily. And I'm going to mention another interesting thing, but further in the presentation, we're going to go to the next part.
Yeah, no, about that, I was just going to say on an anecdotal note that that AI definitely had more training on poetry than I have. So I'm an
Yeah,
easily fooled person.
yeah, there's that too. So if the poem was written by so Lord Byron is a well-known poet, so he did understood the rules and was very specialized in that. So if it was maybe written by a human who was like a part-time poet, maybe it would have looked more like the AI one. So there's that to consider. Let's go into the next section, which is medicine and healthcare. So, large language models help with medical question answering, clinical information extraction, indexing, health record management, and patient communication, like the chat box. If anyone is working with um, Regina Maria, they know that they also have medical chatbots. You can ask, and you can ask them different type of medical questions. And it can, in fact, help with to eliminate administrative hassles and promote better patient care. We're going to look at two examples for two of those usages. It can assist doctors by analyzing patient records and suggesting possible diagnosis or treatment plans. And we have one example in EBM Watson Health, which is now Merative, and it has been used to assist oncologists in recommending cancer treatments based on medical text. Now, don't think that it can spot cancer or anything, but it can help make it easier on the doctors. And it can reduce administrative workload by transcribing doctor-patient conversation and summarizing notes. And we have an example, Nuance Dragon Medical One, that was made by Microsoft, that uses AI-powered speech recognition to generate medical documentation. And as we will see in the next section, um, America has tried to implement lots of those things. Most of those are sourced in that country, and we have usage in law. And they are, of course, not expected to completely replace human lawyers in the near future, but they do have the potential to transform the legal profession. And those are some things that they can help with, and some examples, of course. They can help with legal research, and we have CoConsole that is powered by GPT-4 that assists in law research and interpretation. They can help with drafting legal documents, and we have Harvey AI, and is actually used by a law firm, again from America. It's called Allen and Overy for contract analysis and drafting. It can also help with litigation analytics, case prediction, and expertise automation. We're going back to further into education and research. So they have some interesting things they are applied with, and I think are very useful. So you can use them for personalized learning. So large models can tailor content and recommendations to students' needs and interests by analyzing their learning data and behavior. They can help you with instructional support tools. Some type of chatbots can be added here. So large language models can assist teachers by offering intelligent tools and platforms for creating content, designing activities, tracking student progress, and providing personalized support. I can say I have tried them for that, but when I was learning German, I preferred some type of text that were found on Deutsche Welle. So I was taking those texts, going to ChatGPT, and asked him to do exercises for me. So he was creating exercises to train my vocabulary. So it's an interesting thing. You can use it for if you're interested. And for educational assessment and feedback, large language models can evaluate students' assignments, exams, and other learning data to offer insights and feedback on their progress. Of course, assisted by a teacher. And we have other mentions that it is very used in the corporations, and as I said earlier, it's very encouraged. It's very useful in data analysis and business because they can process vast amounts of unstructured information, including text, documents, social media posts, and customer reviews. And something maybe that if you use social media, any type of social media, you might have observed, it's very used for content moderation. So it filters content based on offensive language, disinformation, explicit content, harassment, and it can even identify when you're using sarcasm or irony. So they perform automatic moderation to a certain degree. There is often a human in the loop system. So at first you get reported by a large language model, by some large language model type. And then if you complain about the report, you're going to get analyzed by a human. So their usage, as you have seen in what I mentioned, above, it's mainly in cooperation with a human, so they don't just go around and do everything for us, but you do need to interact with them, and someone with experience needs to interact with them. Anna, if you want to go.
Sure, I will share the screen to make the process much easier. If you could please let me know if I check if you could see everything. Well, it's loading. Can you see it well?
Yes,
Yes.
it's fine.
Oh, perfect. Now, starting from the very idea that it's very hard to see what is the difference between a human or a LLM program, we could start with the comparison that Mirela has made with the poems. And the one of the most emphasized points in the academic literature about that is that it is trying to mimic the result of the human cognition, trying to mimic exactly what we would expect to see. But the only problem is that we, as socially speaking, the dynamic is so diverse and so interchanging that it would be, even with let's the best strain that we could currently imagine that it would have, it would still be very, very hard to replicate fully what we would expect, considering all the nuances. I would say socioeconomic, but we could call it however we want to, because we should also expect the social nuances inside that community, inside the country, inside the specific place, because there will be an inner community that would have been built. I don't want to go into the sociology aspects too much, but let's start with this point, that this is where the biggest emphasis has been put. And why, and the main reason I'm saying human cognition is because, well, we're coming from the cognitive science background. So at this point, I'm having the opportunity to present it from this point of view. Now, you can see the disclaimer on the right side. Please consider the rapid growth and development. Funny enough that we've done this presentation quite recent, so the risk of this information being outdated is not that high. All the resources we have used were, I did, because the history of language is not really relevant in this case, is 2024, because as I've been researching, realized that this technology, and maybe industry revolution, if it could be called that way, it will be the most rapidly changing. So a 2023 resource, considering the AI limitation, is definitely outdated. And I can guarantee that you will almost find nothing in the libraries anymore. I've checked that. Let's start with specific functional constraints. And why functional? Because we see it from a functionalist point of view, understanding the reason behind it has specific actions. This is both ways, and it's also in the way that you could see that the algorithm is processed, now from the limitations aspect, and also from its own way of understanding your arguments or your cognition, if you use it as a psychotherapist, as you might have heard already if you haven't used it as well. And I don't really advise you. I will tell you why a bit later in the slides. You could see that there's this very common causation. You can see that cause and effect, even though quite funnily, it has big problems understanding or making a difference between how do you call it, correlation or causations, and you will see that. Now, starting from here, let's once again unpack it very quickly based on and making a small emphasis on what Mirela and Tibi has presented. Looking from a limitation point of view, you can see the question formulation. So is this specific, how Tibi was calling it earlier, that specific token, which is the word. So let's put it this way. We formulate the question with the words because we focus on the LLMs, and then we process it. It receives the data, but what kind of data? That's the question. So from the, let's say, funny speaking psychotherapist point of view, well, you have to be very, very specific in order to help you with the answer. Because it might be incomplete or having a very poor quality. It depends who you're asking, because if you're asking another, let's say, LLM model, it could say, well, the quality was very high because it could do the maximum it could do based on the information you have provided. You can only benefit from a human that is fully understanding, because you might not benefit from a, let's say, foreigner from a different culture either, to fully understand you, to fully understand your specific nuances. Let's say how it would be for the abstract art. You might either fully feel it, or you might either quite study a bit or study the artist a bit in order to fully understand. So you also need some data as interpreting art or artist. So coming back here, data retrieval. If data is missing, then the quality is missing. Then after we receive the token word data, you have to, the LLM has to prepare it. Pre-processing, cleaning, formatting data for LLM input may introduce error or bias, which might be quite interesting because they might be as well very well seen. This might sound as a contradiction to my own presentation, but this might as well be seen as a cognitive bias, as when we only receive the data. Well, but there are a bit more limitations here. So we still have a bit of an advantage as humans, hopefully for longer. LLM interference. It may generate hallucinated answers due to insufficient or skewed training data. When it happened oftentimes, and my colleagues could relate because we've been discussing about this while doing a few of some experiments, as you're providing it more data, let's take it, for example, the last model of ChatGPT. As you provide more data, it starts hallucinating because it doesn't really have a specific path to go on anymore. So imagine that you're building a puzzle, and that puzzle is not having the usual pieces, so you're building a Mona Lisa picture, but you're building certain paths with those elements, tokens, words, however we want to call it. And then as you're giving it more elements, you will basically give it more specific algorithmic thinking, building more paths, I'm sorry. So it won't necessarily know in which direction because you have given it so many paths. Then it will take whatever seems the most convenient or the best one, the most relevant one, and it will give you the answer. We might call it poor quality, but it's going to call it the best that the algorithm could do based on the data. So it will still be a long and unexpected work that should be implemented in the AI training in the future. I'm not sure if that specific work, or let's say the magic potion that might be used in order to understand how to rebuild the specific algorithm could work, but this is where we specifically have these limitations. Moving on. Answer generation. Answers might lack the necessary context or domain-specific knowledge for the user to trust the result. And then we have to validate the data. Inaccurate or misleading answers may slip through validation and presented to the users. For the same reasons that were mentioned before. Few more or less, I won't go into the technical part of it, but as a bigger picture, the above mentioned reasons are usually the main reasons. I don't know if you see. Okay. user feedback and iteration, and then going back, question processing, and doing this whole loop. And as you're giving it, usually it happens that as you're giving ChatGPT, for example, that's one I've been using. So that's here is where I can call myself best competent to give you specific examples. Doing this over a loop and going back, then you will realize that the answers will become more and more ambiguous. And we might say, okay, if it's mimicking the human cognition, then it might be fed with information that might help it better understand the nuances. Yes and no, because it will do it very vaguely and in some specific ways that you might not really expect. Okay. So it has significant advancements, and it can very well mimic the result of the human cognition, as we could see in the poem. It faces those limitations, and we will delve into some more of them, where we usually face the most problems. We will see the major weaknesses as reasoning, creativity, bias, both cognitive bias and both moral bias, data dependency, how well it is, how much is it dependent on data, and how adaptable it is. No true reasoning, it lacks a deep understanding. It does not understand the meaning behind, and as we mentioned, and we will delve through that specific example, it doesn't really understand the difference between causation and correlation. So it doesn't have, moving on here to the next one, it doesn't have true conceptual reasoning, even though it's generating the answers that it is expected based on the training that is based on the data that we have given. And we might think, okay, then we will give it more data and the more complex training, so we will have more specific paths in the architecture of it that it can generate better answers. Well, yes and no, because it might be constructed past that it will eventually make no sense, and we will see that a bit later. It fails at abstract reasoning for quite obvious reasons and cannot challenge its own conclusions. You should try that. It's pretty fun and challenging. It might not handle abstract or new ideas anyhow, and think about a new idea as a new scientific research or a mathematical equation, or let's say that you would ask it to create a new recipe, for example, in cooking. So you might as well tell it to, please, let's have these ingredients and let's think about something. It will take we take the best algorithm, and we're saying the best scenario. It would only reconstruct some combinations of the existing combinations. It will not be really able at this point, or maybe next month, who knows. It will not be able to create something absolutely revolutionary. It might make something it might create something with specific nuances that you might not expect. So it's also challenging you to think outside the box, but this is coming with some certain limitations. Well, I would say that these specific limitations now, they might have an advantage while we have these limitations, because afterwards we might not anymore. But the biggest advantage of interacting with an AI model is that it might unexpectedly force you to think outside the box at that specific point of time, because the specific combinations that you would see, that it would absolutely lack any kind of so-called socially acceptable common sense, then it will force you to look at specific perspectives differently. So let's say that in a sort of an inception-ish, if that's a word, I don't think so, manner, it might help you to see that as much as it's having this limitation. So we can still see an advantage here as it is. It has limitations in handling abstract ideas, so it is what it is. Cause and effect, what I've been emphasizing about until now. It might understand and might give you the definition of a dog by making a comparison with the cat or other animals. So focusing now on this, that's a simple example. We would know focus with the current complex algorithm or much more complicated examples because you're asking it, hey, what's a dog? It will respond you. But the architecture of it is built in such a way that it doesn't necessarily know specifically how to pinpoint what a dog is without a comparison with a cat. So we have to put a cat here to explain you that, hey, yeah, it doesn't do that. You will understand that. You will understand by choosing the path, but you're choosing the path by excluding the other paths. We might do it in a more logical context or less in mathematical context, but this is how it is built at this point of time. So yes, it quite lacks the casual understanding. So another example would be, imagine that from a statistical point of view, thinking about the paths, it will make the correlation between unexpected elements. So we can also say, and we will discuss about that as well, that of course it lacks the so-called socially acceptable common sense. You will see, statistically speaking, that the people that are buying an umbrella, usually they're buying it from a coffee shop down the corner. So at that coffee shop, because they're selling umbrellas, they are selling, of course, guess what? Coffee. So in this case, the AI could develop in the further trainings based on statistics. It might understand that it's raining outside because people are buying coffee, or vice versa. When it rains, then people buy coffee. That's how it is. That's the specific understanding. It's not able at this point to go deeper than that. Do you have any questions or any curiosities about that? Or did it happen to you while you were, if you were using the AI? By the way, I can't see you because I have the screen on. So just jump in if you have. I don't think so. Seems. Moving on.
Well, I've been putting down some questions, but I think I'll just mention them all at the end. So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Fields of handling unstructured information or ambiguous data. If you remember the second slide that we were displayed about the specific errors it has in every step in time, then if we do not give it more specific data, then it might not know which specific path to take in the algorithm that it was trained on. Not specific and not that relevant to an LLM model, even though that's our today's topic, but I want to add that. It might, for example, if you think about an AI that has involved LLM model, if you give it a quite ambiguous image of a stop sign, and it's missing out specific pixels that it might make it similar to another one, that it will confuse it. It will have quite big chances of confusing it. While it might not have the capacity of the human eye having the peripheral vision or the capacity to see so-called the bigger picture in order to understand the whole context of it. So it might not be so able to, for example, look at the sky and see that that cloud is shaped in a bear, for example. Or it might not understand an LLM specifically now, making this contrast. It might not specifically understand the idioms or the jokes that we would make. So that's break the leg. It will think that you are pointing out to something harmful, and hopefully and not being banned from this specific application. Lacking common sense and intuition as well, so it fails to grasp specific content, and specifically speaking about training based on statistics, as we were discussing a bit earlier about the correlation between buying coffee while it's raining, just because the human has made an error, it wouldn't understand. So comes to the so-called human common sense, it might not specifically understand that that specific human has made an error. So because you were tired and you arrived home and you put the keys in the fridge, it might understand that, well, then this means that humans put the keys in the fridge. it might not make the difference between the causation, correlation, and some other specific concepts until it will be trained in a different technical manner, which I'm not going to delve into. And we should also consider as well the specific social nuances. And not only speaking of the nuances, but also speaking about the understanding or processing a specific depth. If we are going into the emotional side, because we've been speaking based on numbers and statistics, it might very, very well mimic let's say, musical creation. You might ask it to act or write as Mihai Eminescu, for example, or you might ask it to create as a, create as a musical, to have a creation as Mozart, for example. It might mimic the result as it is trained to mimic the result of the human cognition, but it will absolutely lack the emotional depth. Now, the controversy that we've been pointing out, and Mirela has been pointing out in the at the poem, is where exactly do we, and to what extent do we follow our intuition to understand which is having emotional depth, or are we just simply tricked by it? Because they're just specific algorithms that might not. There's another concept that we should consider: how much are we personally trained to notice these specific, very, very thin nuances of them? So in these limitations, we could also see some cognitive limitations that we have. So in this way, we could say, well, then we can't say we have so many differences, do we? It depends. It reinforces bias and it can be unfair. I put in the brackets legal context, because there would be two, let's say, two specific theses that we could consider. What if it is, and it is not only what if, but it is at this moment having this limitation of not being so able at this point to keep the confidential data secured, and that's the reason that so many big companies and so many companies are asking the employees to not to use the LLMs with confidential information, because they're specific and there have been experiments proving ways that you can corrupt it somehow to leak specific information. I do not know exactly to replicate you how it is done, but it can be done. There was another example on the internet a long time ago mentioned that's out of the academic research. How exactly it might be intentionally or even unintentionally trained to have a specific political viewpoint. So you have to ask it a series of questions in order to ask to require it to present you with another perspective. By high quality data, when we say that it cannot function with high quality data, we specifically mention that it is hard to ask it to be accurate on time, in the second, in the specific context. If we think back to the social context, by providing with high quality, meaning very, very vast and very I'm sorry, very complex data. If we remember specifically when we were discussing that, even though the algorithm is complex, when you give it more elements, you wouldn't know which path to choose based on the elements that the various paths actually were created. So there are also the nuances, there are also the ever-changing factors that are changing in every second, and also unpredictable real-world problems. So moving on, it cannot self-correct by itself because it can only do based on the information that it has. That's very short, just as a small reminder for us based on the training. And do not use it as a psychotherapist as well. On the same reasons highlighted before, it cannot specifically understand the nuances. And where is the biggest risk? is that it might unintentionally validate our fears or validate any potential harmful behavior we might have. So it's very subtly very risky. We will stay a bit here. Helpert was and still is a LLM that is built to act as a psychotherapist. So here is a comparison. We can see the answer. I tend to blame whatever, and it starts with that's such, however. It starts with validating, as that was the most common expression that an LLM is using when you're interacting with it. Well, that's right. Here's whatever. You're absolutely correct. So if you're using often the LLM programs, this phrase might already be very familiar to you, as it was to me for a specific time. So I can see in the internet, and I want to as well bring a small emphasis there, that there is communities created around the users of the LLMs. And these communities developed so much recently, and by recently because it's such a dynamic industry, that there are plenty of people on the internet that started developing specific prompts. And this is what a quite viral prompt. That's not, by the way, just a small disclaimer. This is not from a academic source. This is from the so-called very well used source used by the Generation Z at least, if not even more, which is called TikTok. So here is a small example of not that it's a page small, of what plenty of LLM users are using in order to understand their deeper layers. It might be, I wouldn't say helpful, it would be highly risky to say helpful, but insightful if you want to make a self-analysis, but not more than that, because as we mentioned before, not here, but we mentioned a bit earlier, it might validate harmful behaviors, and it might potentially highlight the risk of making you go into the, let's so-called, wrong rabbit hole of your own, let's say, haunting thoughts or so-called traumas, which might not give you the best direction. They give us, please act like this, tell me this, what is this and that, identify it, and then unpack the answer and unpack again. Before unpacking no further, no further layers remain. What is that? So it is explaining, as you could notice here, this prompt became viral because it specifically explains how the algorithm should work on the information received in that specific chat. So it's quite, I do not know to what extent is it accurate, or is it giving a good path into unlocking these layers, cognitive layers, but it is explaining specifically how to analyze the information further that is being given. And it as well might not very well understand specific social nuances. So making a small transition from this quite heavy prompt to this one, well, you could tell it a book long of pages of your life and your inner thoughts, but if it still doesn't understand the nuances, then it is what it is. It is too hard to deal with it. It might have good jokes. Now, it depends on your humor. It usually has, as an LLM, well, it is quite, let's say, self-explanatory that it will have word jokes. As why did the AI refuse? It's okay if you don't laugh. I'm joking. Anyhow. There are some specific pieces of advice that we wanted to highlight here. So at least if you've been listening us for a lot of time, and thank you for this, At least you could take away specific things or advice or maybe some insights of if you're using it, how to use it, and what to be cautious of. Starting with be careful and aware of not displaying any confidential information. As we know, the old and very good expression, what goes in the internet stays in the internet. And regardless of the compliance rules that are promoted from the LLM's creators, we do still not have control over it. If you want to use it for different purposes and if you want to receive a specific result, then you have to be very clear and concise. And as we could see in the earlier prompt, use specific follow-up statements to build upon the initial ones and be aware of the path that it is being taken. It might help, it might happen that as you give it just a bit more information, it will just go on a completely different path. Make sure to double check the model responses as it has a tendency to hallucinate. Again, be very careful as much as possible if you use it as a so-called psychotherapist, because it might subtly encourage you and validate aspects that may become or are harmful to you. Take advantage of the model memory's capacity by using a single context and a simple chat to reduce the likelihood of hallucinations. Focus, be as specific and concise as possible. And understand that as it's written here, the models are adapted to reason in human language. So the closer to a most natural form of language, the better for its processing. And for us to remember that it does the best it can with the resources available. It depends on the perspective we look at. We now consider that it has specific limitations when we see that it is advantage only in contrast with something else. And what is the contrast in this presentation is the human cognition, or better called the result of the human cognition. And this is it. I will close the presentation. I will start sharing my screen. Do you have any questions or any input? Did you have any specific insight, or did you resonate with any part of the presentation while you were using it? I'm curious about this.
Well, first of all, let me thank you all for this presentation. There was a lot of information in it. I learned quite things about LLMs hearing you. So thank you again. And yes, if anyone in the audience has any question or comments, don't be shy.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Ana Maria. I'm from Bucharest, Romania. I graduated in 2002, so a while ago. First of all, thank you, because you give me hope, because you're very young and very talented and great at what you're doing. And then regarding this presentation, I have two comments. First of all, regarding the risks that you've just described, Anna, in your presentation just now, I believe the only way I can see out of these risks would be by educating people. I think that more and more people, especially from the younger generations, need to understand how it works exactly, because they were born with it, they will continue to be born with it, and they will not question it because they will know nothing else. We still know something else from back when, in the old time, but these younger generation will not. So they need to understand that it is a tool, a great tool with great potential, but it comes with risks. And in order to do that, they need to understand how it works, just like you presented now. So this, in my opinion, should be part of the mandatory school curriculum moving forward. And second, going back to Tiberiu's presentation, you know the concerns that Plato had about writing?
Yeah.
In a very strange way, that gives me hope as well. Because Plato had some fears when writing was invented, that people would become lazy, stupid, they'll stop thinking, talking, telling stories, because it's written text, it's not oral text, right? It gives me hope because it's somehow the exact same type of process. We've come up with this new great tool. We have the same fears right now, but we beat the system. We beat the fears once. We can do it again, and we can win at this. And it's with the help and knowledge of people like you. So thank you for your presentation tonight.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. You're definitely on point with what you said. I mean, for younger people, of course, education can be leveraged through social media. It's like a positive twist among all the fear mongering of what social media does. There's also, by the way, a European initiative called Elements of AI. So you can type in the search bar elements of. I could send it over actually. I've got it open. Just give me a second. I'll put it in the chat. It's an interesting thing. I haven't used it, but it's a solution that comes from the European Union. It's available in all languages of the countries part of the European Union. It just launched Ukrainian apparently. And what I wanted to say is that perhaps it was a valid concern. You know, fear of the unknown is absolutely natural, and we should not just brush it under the rug, but we should embrace the fact that we don't know what's happening. I mean, we know what's happening, we understand sort of what's happening, but it does pose dangers, like you said. So perhaps this platform should. I think it's pretty unknown. I mean, I stumbled upon it by accident somehow. I don't remember when. I think it was.
Sorry, Tiberiu, what is it exactly?
So it's a platform that's called it's called Elements of AI, and it is a free introduction to artificial intelligence. So
Okay,
there
so it's
goes
like an educational resource.
yeah. So it's been
Okay.
developed by the University of Helsinki. I'm just reading that from the website right now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I haven't pursued it myself, but at least from an initiative standpoint, I find it very interesting and very welcome in this, in the climate that we have now.
Thanks for sharing, Tiberiu.
Welcome.
Any other questions or comments? While you are thinking, I just remembered when talking about risks, I remembered I had a short conversation today with some of my colleagues at school. And for our business, let's say, of course, one of the main risks we see is related to the use of these kind of tools in doing projects, homeworks, which could be summed up like this. It's the fear of unnoticed plagiarism. So we just invented tools to identify plagiarism, tools like Turnitin or stuff like that, and then the LLMs appeared. So now it's not that easy. They are getting better and better, and my colleagues just were just concerned that it's like a race, right, between the tools like GPT, and then you have other tools like identified the use of GPT and stuff like that. So yeah, that is an area that maybe it's interesting to talk about and to see how things will evolve. Because as you said, Tiberiu, and Ana Maria also said, um, it is a technology, and just like any other technology in the history of humankind, it's not good nor bad. It just depends on how we use it. And for sure, LLMs are here. They can help in so many ways. They can harm us in several ways. So it's a matter of how we use it. And what Ana Maria said, it's definitely true. Education should and hopefully will play an important role in this in the near future. By the way, also talking about educational resources, maybe probably you know, but for the people in the audience, there's a series of events hosted by the theoretical philosophy department seminar. So in the near future, I will also put the link to the Facebook page of the theoretical philosophy department, where you can find more information. There are some conferences, some talks specifically on this topic. So I know this because Andrei told me last night, and I took a look, and yeah, so if you're interested in hearing more talks about the topic, they have some in the near future.
One more thing, maybe. I'm sure you're familiar with the Center for Humane Technology. It's very popular. It's all over YouTube and social media, so I'm sure you know about it. But I think about a week ago, something popped up in my feed, my Facebook, because I'm that old, Facebook feed. So it was the public testimony of Tristan before the US Congress. And the way this person, the way he presented the current status of AI, the potential risks, the potential benefits, if you listen to his discourse, even from a discourse analysis perspective, it's really interesting. In my opinion, snippets of that discourse should be studied and can be studied and discussed with kids of different ages, young people of different ages in schools, because he uses a very accessible language. He is really down to earth. He's not trying to scare anyone. He's just very factual. And as I said, even from the perspective of how that discourse was built, I think it would make for a very interesting workshop or lesson.
So what was that exactly again, Anna? You said it was the discourse?
It's the public testimony of Tristan. I don't know his last name, Tristan something, from Center of Humane Technology. Okay. A public testimony before the US Congress recently, because they had this debate around social media, monopoly, artificial intelligence, whether it should be stopped, paused, delayed. It's really interesting. I can put in the link in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Because then I will gather all your inputs, and usually I send an email with info and with the link for the recording, and I will put all those things in that email for everybody to have them.
Well, I'm pretty sure all of our phones got the suggestion, so yeah. the algorithm will bring up this to your feed as well.
Okay, yeah, that's also true. There's a comment in the chat, I think. Bianca says, yeah, that some more examples could have made our understanding better, just like that poem. Yeah, okay. Vlad, you have a question?
Bonsoir, je parle français, n'est pas anglais.
Poți să întrebi în română dacă vrei.
Ok. Privitor, bună seara, Vlad Talpo, student material la Facultatea de Litere. Privitor la prezentarea în echipă, pot spune că cel mai mult mi-a plăcut istoria alfabetelor, care mă poate ajuta la înțelegerea sistemelor de scriere și de codificare. În rest, foarte interesant.
Ok, mulțumim, thank you.
Cu plăcere.
There's one more thing I wanted to add, because there's an idea that pops up in several presentations. The idea of lack of understanding. One of the limitations of LLMs you mentioned is the lack of understanding, let's put it briefly. Now, in my view, one of the problems here is the fact that I think that we don't fully understand what understanding is, or to put it better, how understanding occurs in humans, so that we cannot replicate it exactly how it is. So that leads to another question, maybe. Is this statistical processing, which is the basis of LLMs, really what our cognitive system do, or is there any other type of mechanism? These are also things that we don't know completely about our cognitive systems. So as I said at the beginning, the AI and LLMs are trying to replicate our cognitive systems. In the case of LLMs, our linguistic systems. The question here is if what we know and what we understand about our cognitive and our linguistic systems is enough to produce proficient models of our system. I don't know exactly, so yeah. But maybe this lack of understanding is due to the fact that understanding in humans implies more than statistical processing, I would guess. I don't know if you have any comment on that, anyone in the audience.
Excuse me, I I want also to say a few words. First of all, I congratulate the three speakers. It was a very nice presentation. I relate it to large language models. I thought if to intervene or not, even in the first presentation, it was that slide with evolution, with that spiral. In fact, maybe it's not very clear what means a LLM. A large language model, it's let's say a model of the language in the sense that given a sequence of words, it generates the next most probable word. This is in fact in LLM. In that history, for example, Eliza is not an LLM. Maybe it was. I was thinking maybe not to intervene because, yes, it might be considered as probably one of the first systems that was supposed to be able to enter into a conversation, into a dialogue. It was very simplistic. But it was effective in the 60s, and also that, for example, BERT or GPT, or these are neural networks, where architectures, transformer architectures, which can be used for training an LLM, but also for other purposes. So an LLM, for example, the idea of LLM is not new. It was an idea of mathematician Markov from many years ago. I don't remember exactly the year, but it's probably the beginning of the 20th century. And the idea was which is the probability that the nth word in a sequence of books of Gogol, for example, it's a given word. And in fact, in mathematics, it is so-called the Markov model, which exactly this it is. It is a sequence of probabilistic events which can be used in computations, and it's a machine learning not based on neural networks, using exactly Markov models, hidden Markov models, for starting from a statistic. It's a statistics. Everything is a statistics here. So having a corpus, you can make a statistic of the sequence of words. And computing mathematically is the most probable word which should follow a given sequence. An LLM is also this. And one implementation is with neural networks, which are trained with like ChatGPT, like these systems, and there are many others, as was said, which are trained with all the text to give this next word. What you presented was very good, very well. Excuse me, I have a cold and I'm not speaking very well. Excuse me. Uh, so what you said, it's more related maybe to chatbots or some other systems which are using an LLM, but also some other things. They might have some rules, they might have some. And in fact, this is also an answer to the problem of understanding, of intuition, of creativity. So these LLMs are, in fact, systems which work statistically and generate. What is amazing, it's that if you trained such a system with all the texts available, you can simulate, you can generate, as everybody may probably have seen, a lot of things, even code, even images, even stories, and so on and so on. But of course, it's not a real understanding. And it was a very good comment. But what means understanding? There are people who say that they have also consciousness, and so sometimes maybe we say about some artifact, some achievement, that it has more than it really has. And we humans, maybe we have the tendency of to maybe think that they are like us, with to give some human. They are very useful. They are very powerful, but we should be aware that this is a statistics. In fact, among what we generally have as a text. And I liked the last presentation of limitations, were very well presented. And the big problem, of course, are hallucinations, ethics, bias, yes, of course. And this was very well presented. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. If there are any other questions or comments.
Maybe understanding as a process is actually the most important thing that we do, because without trying to understand, we couldn't live. Like in the poem that Mirela showed us, if we wouldn't have tried to understand the meaning of of the verses, we just would have remain stuck there
Or
without
pick,
trying to understand.
or pick the wrong answer, like I did, right?
I was actually thinking about the second option, so I picked the wrong answer as well. Or in that prompt that Anna showed us, is the same. Like if we don't analyze the words, we can't see the mistakes, like those mistakes that appeared in here, like the last sentence with something champion. It was a word that shouldn't have been there, of course, because they were just verbs and then champion without any logics at all. And if we don't try to understand, then we don't live and we don't show that we are human beings, that we have these cognitive functions, more or less. It's just my opinion, but I think it's something essential for us.
Yeah. Thank you, Flavia, for the comments.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, no other comments, I hope you all had a great 2 hours session. I hope we learned something new. I definitely learned some new things. Thank you again, Anna, Mirela, and Tiberiu. And I will try to gather all the input we had tonight. And together with the link to the recording, I will send all this info in a message to everybody in a couple of days, okay? So thank you again, and hope to see you all at our next sessions with new and interesting topics and invited speakers. I hope you all have a great night. Thank you and take care.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye bye.
Thank you.